My guest today is Dr. Mona Sobhani. One of the big themes of this series, perhaps the biggest theme, has been the idea of keeping an open mind to things that might violate your existing model of the world. And I was lucky enough to meet Mona about a year ago now. I read her book, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, which is very highly recommended because nothing has challenged my fairly settled, maybe even complacent worldview as much as reading that book. In fact, I remember reading it on a flight to Omaha and feeling physically sick with how much it made me realize I didn't know about the world. Um, I wanted to maybe first talk to Mona about her story and how she came to this research. But before we kicked off, I was also going to say that Mona and I are going to discuss a lot of topics that are quote unquote woo and fall outside of the existing mainstream. But I think when dealing with these topics, one of the core tenets of what we're doing here at the Leading Edge is to try and make them practical, to try and make them applicable to your life, and try and land them back in the real world. And that's what we're going to do over the course of this interview, I hope. So, Dr. Mona Sobhani, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me, Tom. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. So let's go straight in. I think it's important to set a little bit of context. If you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about the story and what led you to this research.
Sure. So I was a hardcore scientific materialist. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, which means I used to scan the brain and analyze its function and structure. But, I was never interested in spirituality or religion. And I was very, because of my scientific training, very anti things that were, as you referred to them, woo-woo. But I had a series of life events happen. I had an existential crisis. And then because I'm Persian, in our culture, we have a tradition of divination, which is essentially fortune telling, which I don't, it has a very negative connotation, that word in Western culture. But if nobody knows what the word divination means, fortune telling is the next best thing. So we have a tradition of that in our culture. My grandmother used to do it, and my mom does it. And they use coffee grounds, but Middle Eastern coffee grounds, like Greek, Turkish, Armenian. They're like thicker. You leave it in the cup, it makes pictures, and then the person tells you things about your life that there's no way that they could possibly know. And I never believed it, but just because, I lived with my mom for a while, and then I visited like during grad school, I would go home every weekend. She started reading for me, and I started keeping track and realized that she was more right than she was wrong. And she wasn't always right, but she was much more right than she was wrong. And she would get the details of things creepily accurately. And there would be things that I would never tell her, like just really intimate, private things about my life that, I wish she wouldn't see and know. And so it got my attention, but I couldn't explain it or reconcile it with my scientific worldview. So I just ignored it until I couldn't. So then I had two events happen. Somebody that my mom saw. One was the death of someone I knew, the murder actually of someone I knew. And the second was the ending of a relationship. And so, and that all happened during my existential crisis, only worsening it. And when you threw the fact that these events were somehow predictable by coffee, it made no sense. And I started to feel like I did not understand the world, despite the fact that I had all this scientific training. So that kind of led me down the road to investigate.
One of the cornerstones of your book is the research around PSI, which, my default assumption, and we should, I guess, define psi in a second, but my default assumption around anything around psychic abilities was that if it existed, it would have been proven by now. Why haven't you won the lottery? Why hasn't James Randi's $1 million prize been claimed?
Mhm.
Why haven't any institutions tested this and proven it? And I think I was proven pretty decisively wrong on almost all counts. But maybe let's talk about the psi stuff first, as for me, it was sort of my entryway into all of these topics.
Sure. It was kind of mine too, because what my mom was doing is psi, which to define it, that's what it's called now, but it's psychic phenomena research essentially. And then now they call it PSI research. So similar to you, I didn't think any research had been done on it. I was the same. I just thought, oh, society acts like, or Western culture, I should say, acts like this has been studied and debunked, or that it's so impossible that it hasn't bothered to be studied. And I just assumed that was the case. So when I started looking into it, which for me, it started with casual interviews. I started this like personal project just for me because I was in such crisis. I thought, I just need to talk to people and ask them questions. So I started interviewing what I call psychics intuitives because I think it's better. It has less of a negative connotation. And I do think it's they're using their intuition. So I started interviewing intuitives and mystics and then scientists. And then I started digging into the research because people started mentioning it to me. They're like, there's been research on this, right? And I didn't know. So I started looking into it and found that there had been like over 100 years of research from really prestigious places like Duke and UCLA and Berkeley and Princeton, and then also across the world. So in other countries, other continents, there was so much research, and it was surprising because a lot of the study protocols that they use, we use similar ones in neuroscience and psychology research. So I was able to read them and assess them because I was familiar with them, and so that was really surprising to me. I was just like, this is pretty solid. I don't know why. Then I started getting confused. I was like, so why does everyone keep saying that parapsychology is, debunked or that there's no evidence for it? Because what I was reading looked like pretty good evidence. So I was confused.
Yeah, one of the passages in your book that really struck me was that the effect sizes were higher than we use for metformin for type 2 diabetes, statins for, I think, cholesterol and antidepressants, and a lot
Mhm.
of the benchmark, social science studies that we use, admittedly, a lot of which are facing a replication crisis. But I
Yes.
would, and also that the study designs were more robust because the people conducting the studies were obviously pretty terrified from a career risk perspective, that if they were seen to be digging into these topics, it could be quite negative for them.
Yeah. So every time they would submit a paper with a topic like this, it's already going upstream, right? You're already going against the norm. So it gets critiqued and criticized and combed over with like a fine-tooth comb, even more so than a normal science paper, because they're, keeping in mind that, oh, the worldview or the basis of this research is already different from the norm, or the mainstream. So they are highly scrutinized and more so than normal research. So yeah, they had a lot of like fail safes or extra controls that even, I mean, yes, really good psychology and neuroscience studies have those too, but they had more so than, what we normally have. And it makes sense. I mean, they're super scrutinized, so they have to control for everything. And yeah, I kept finding that actually, and I double checked it because I remember when I started reading, I saw that, and it's true, the effect sizes were small. And so just for an audience that's not scientific, an effect size is basically how robust a phenomenon is. So like if the entire population has it and it's really strong, if we were like the X-Men, psychic phenomena would be a high effect size, like 0.8, 0.7, whatever. But most things in nature, because of the high variability, have low effect sizes, or medium to, so, and some of the psychic phenomena was low, medium effect size. Some of it was high, but not really. Most of it was low and medium, like most other research. And the studies I was reading, I saw that they kept referencing, I think, aspirin. So then I pulled up like like one of the newly published at the time, I think it was 2020. So some newer paper, I don't remember which one it was, but I cited it in the book, looking at the effect sizes of common the most common prescription drugs. And that's when I found that I was like, yeah, for diabetes, for depression, like all of those were sometimes lower than what they were printing for the Psi research and sometimes just on par. But it's true that if you were trying to get it clinically approved or whatnot, and you were only looking at effect size, then it would be comparable. But it's it's not as repeatable a phenomena than some others.
It really interested me that that your psi abilities corresponded with your belief that it was possible, but also that it seems to exist on a bell curve where some people are just naturally better at it than others.
Yeah, which is true for many things. For, I mean, human talent is like that. And I think when you look at the sports research, like elite athletes, you find that like people who believe that they play better, like do better, or people who spend the time to visualize and imagine, like they they do that even when they're not practicing. They do it because your brain doesn't know the difference between the past, the present, or the future. So if you're, and whether you're doing it or not. So just imagining doing something physical, your body thinks it's doing it, and it's practice.
Was there any like single study that you pointed people to, or there was a turning point in you that was just like, ugh, I can't really ignore this, and I think other people are going to have trouble ignoring it as well?
Well, in science, you never look at a single study. So for me, it was a paper, but it was the review of the meta-analyses that I wrote about in detail in the book. So for me, it was that, because even reading, and that's what I thought immediately when I was reading the single studies. I thought, well, some of these look good, some don't, but that's the norm in science. And there's no topic in science that you can study that every paper will be will be positive about it. So I was like, oh, well, this is the norm. So then that's when I was glad to have found the review of meta-analyses. And meta-analyses is when you take all the studies in a field and you look at the stats to look at the effect size, and then a review is not like as statistically or mathematically involved. It's just looking at the field as a whole and saying, okay, there's all these papers or all these meta-analyses, like, is this phenomenon real or not? Where we had leaning towards. And then when I found that for psi, it was published in 2018 and by a journal from the American Psychological Association, and it said that evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of it. So, I mean, once I read that, I was just sat there kind of dazed, like, huh, okay.
It sort of goes back to this whole thing around this when I was reading it and the fact that, I felt physically sick. I was like, okay, so like if you have, find the effect sizes a week, but if you have these really prestigious institutions and these hundreds of studies, and you would think it's like, why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't this on the front page of a newspaper when it comes out? Um, I've been having this conversation with people for a year, and I've noticed that people often get very angry about this topic and
Mhm.
assume it's gullible. They go ad hominem quite quickly. Why do you think there's so much resistance to this topic in general when the science is as strong in a lot of other areas?
Because humans are not as rational as they think they are. If we were, I would present to you the evidence and you would change your mind. But that rarely ever happens on any topic, because humans are not rational, because your beliefs are based on your emotions and your past and how you were raised and what you think about yourself and how you fit in the world, what you think about the world. And anything that threatens those core emotions causes a reaction, a defensive reaction, because your core is threatened. So it's not surprising. Once I understood that too, which took me a little, it sounds easy, but took me a long time because I was in it. My ego was defending and myself and my worldview. It took a while to see that. But once I did, I'm like, oh, I just have to unlink these emotions from these thoughts and unravel my core self, which is not easy, but can be done. And then I won't be threatened by a view that's different than mine, which is really what the world needs right now, like on every topic.
Yeah, well, one of the funny things is that I have this general view that any threat to our worldview that implies that there is some sort of external intelligence to our own like egoic agency gets smashed down far quicker than anything else for kind of obvious reasons. It's like we tend to think we're the boss. And with all of your work, there's this implication that there's perhaps more going on than our own individually kind of head-centric intelligence. And so I found that any topic And the simplest one that I like is, attractors, which is that we can be guided by things in our environment in a potentially benign and intelligent way. These ideas really freak people out, and I think because they threaten like the integrity of our ego structure quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed that the more kind of intellectualized and rational someone is, the more triggered they get by this topic in general. Has that been your finding, or is that consistent?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the Western culture has really emphasized being an individual and also being in control of your life. Like the whole culture is the main emphasis is control, control, control everything, control your circumstances, your environment, just control everything. And the truth is, we're not in control. And that's like one of the hardest things humans have to come to face about themselves in their lives. But whenever that's threatened, that idea, they feel unsafe. And then that's when you see these reactions. And I found that when I was just starting, when I had read this book, that Many Lives, Many Masters, that I sent to everyone. And my friends had wildly different reactions, and it was so interesting to watch. Some were just like, I'll read it. You recommended it. I'm going to read it. And then they read it, and then they couldn't wait to talk about it. And then some were like, oh, I got the book, but I'm not going to read it. Like, these are some of my best friends. You're not going to read the book that I bought and sent to you? Okay, why not? And they'd be like, well, I just think it's stupid. I'm not going to read it. I'm like, okay, well, you could just read it and then decide if it's stupid or not. But they are like so threatened by it. And I remember one of them actually said to me, they're like, no, I am in control of my life. Like, I'm not going to read anything that makes me think that like, that I'm not in control, or that my fate or destiny is not in my hands. And I was like, all right, sure.
I mean, there in a sentence, I think you have the rationale behind a lot of the negative reaction, the idea that you might not be in full control. And I'm really glad you brought up Many Lives, Many Masters, because that's what I want to talk about next. Because if there's been any topic that has surprised me the most over the last 12 months, it's been the uh, reincarnation was not on my radar, either positively or negatively, as part of my worldview at all. In
Neither.
really any context. I was dimly aware that like it was sort of an Eastern mindset. And then I encountered Ian Stevenson's work through your book and Many Lives, Many Masters. And I was really confounded by the strength of, empirical evidence in this area. And I
Yeah.
wonder if you could maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. It started with the past life regression stuff, but that is not there's not a lot of studies on that. There's in general not a lot of studies on therapeutic methods like that. So, but that's what got me into this, because the stories from those books are crazy. And there was like three, I think, psychiatrists in the 80s, is Brian Weiss, Michael Newton, and Roger Wolger, who all did not believe in this or anything, but stumbled upon it in their work and then ended up doing it. And then they all wrote these wonderful books and tried to put them in academic frameworks of like, what the heck is going on with our patients? But so I can come back and talk about that. But the more compelling work is from the University of Virginia. They have a department that was founded by Ian Stevenson and now is run by oh dear, I forgot his name, but wonderful gentleman whose name will come to me. And it was to examine kids, sometimes between the ages of 2 to 5. They will report having memories from another life, or like dreams or whatnot. And the parents sometimes are so confounded, or they don't believe in reincarnation, or, they'll have some other religious background, but they will take them to the University of Virginia. And I think they also traveled around the world. I think Ian Stevenson also went around the world. Yeah. But they got all these cases and they investigated them. They're like, okay, let's see what the child says. They created these comprehensive questionnaires. And then there's all these metrics they use to determine whether, like, if it's verifiable, like, can we, they may not be able to give a name, a first and a last name, the kids, but maybe they can give enough detail, like where did the person live? How did they die? What were their family members' names? Identifying marks on the body, stuff like that. So they would get all this information, then they would go try to find the person who allegedly had passed away, whose quote unquote soul or essence was transferred into this child. And I think 65% of the cases they were able to identify the person, which is just nuts. And then the craziest thing that still is so weird to me, and feels important is that sometimes in the way that the person died, like if it was like a gunshot to the head, like if it was suicide or whatever, like a spear through the stomach, the next incarnation will have a birthmark of where that person was killed or how they were killed, like that wound. And then when they found, so like when the University of Virginia went to look at some of these, they would look at autopsy reports or whatnot, they could confirm those reports from the kids. And I just think that's so wild. And I still can't really wrap my head around that.
Yeah, that was the single thing for me where I was like, blimey, that's like both creepy and amazing because it's reasonably solid proof. And I mean, this was what, 2,400 children, not with the
Yes,
birthmarks, but overall in the study where, you have to deal with that in quite a sober way in order to discount it. Um,
it's a lot.
I guess, if you've been listening to what we're talking about and you're still listening, there's the idea that there's something here that our understanding of the nature of reality isn't quite what we thought it was. You've been immersed in all of this for a very long time. I guess the open question would be, how has this changed how you engage with the world, or how has it changed how you perceive the world, if not both?
It's changed a lot of things and it's changed slowly over time. So initially, the biggest change was I started asking myself, so from the past life regression books that I read, the first thing that I picked up was that we come here to learn lessons and that we choose challenges for ourselves in our lives. So you suddenly go from a scientific materialist worldview where I believe the universe is random and meaningless, and my life is probably meaningless, or it's up to me to decide the meaning, to suddenly, oh, wow, like maybe my consciousness decided this before I got here and set up these challenges that I'm viewing as like terrible things that have happened to me. They're the challenges I'm supposed to overcome or whatever, deal with. And suddenly you go from this like victim mentality to like, a detective to be like, all right, what do I have to figure out to solve this case? Like, how do I beat this challenge? So you kind of step up to the plate. And that, so that was the first like change. It was a psychological reframing. So it was a new psychological narrative that entered my day to day that actually made my day to day living better immediately. So that was already surprising. I was like, oh, the spirituality is kind of useful, or whatever this is, whatever you want to call it. I was calling it spirituality, but like, it's useful. So that was the first one. And then I think as you just continue to learn and grow, you start to, it's almost like, so it started with a very zoomed in perspective on my life, but as you go on, your perspective zooms out and you start to view everyone and every relationship in the whole world in terms of these dynamics. And so before, where I would feel like despair at the state of the world, now, now I feel like everyone's just playing their part. And some people are failing their lessons. A lot of people failing their lessons, but no judgment. But
Yeah.
yeah, but I see it as all like roles. People are just playing these roles, and not that it's not serious, and not that we're supposed to step back and let them play their role if it's threatening, you know, our whatever, our values or whatnot. But just that understanding kind of, at least it calms me down a little. I'm not so like, what is this reality? This is terrible. Now I had a little more of an understanding of, these are like the universe. I see it as like, yin and yang. Like there are forces, there's good and bad, there's dark, light and dark, and they're supposed to be both.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I that was my takeaway as well, which is that if you look backwards and frame your life as, have I been learning this lesson? And something I took from your book is that the purpose of soul lessons is to become more open, more loving, and more quote unquote source like, which I imagine is language that will alienate some people. But it's just the idea that your direction of travel is known. And when you contextualize your life in the context of those lessons, it makes you wonder, am I learning the lesson? Will the beatings continue? Or like, was I put in that position to learn the lesson? And again, that takes away the victim mentality. So it's one of those things where I remain on the fence very much so about this idea. And yet it has been incredibly helpful in the living
Yeah.
of my life.
Yeah, it's really helpful, somehow comforting. I mean, sometimes you're like, well, sometimes I get resentful. I'm like, I'm done with this lesson. Let's move on. And the universe is like, no. And then I just sit there with resentment, like, mm.
Well, one of the bizarre patterns that you see in, you know, quote unquote wisdom research is that basically death and rebirth of your models or over the course of your life is this arguably the most important feature that, to go back to your work caused a death and rebirth in my materialist paradigm in a lot of ways, which was very, very difficult for me to deal with. But you have this situation where people's models collapse and then they incorporate an anomaly and then they become more complex and more complete. And so when I was looking at this, I was like, wow, this fractal pattern applies at every level of reality that I've studied. Why wouldn't it also apply to us across lives? And then I was like, well, blimey, that, maybe yes, maybe no, but it is interesting that it seems to fit every other pattern that's out there.
Yeah. I mean, it does feel important. And I think that even regardless of this spiritual framework or whatever, I do think humans just continually change. Our identities change all the time as we move through life. And I think Western culture does a really poor job of talking about this archetype, this like, or this death and rebirth. Like it's almost like such a big, such a problem for everyone when it happens because we're not like prepared for it. Like we don't have these initiation rites early on in life. We're so protected from everything. So when something does happen, we're like, crisis. Meanwhile, that's just the point of life. It's to like continuously go through these to evolve.
Well, that is also another question, which is that it seems to me we're on the cusp of finding this anomaly, right? And I don't know what you think, but as someone who's actually surprisingly not particularly interested in the philosophical debate, it seems to me that the anomaly that we haven't incorporated is the idea that the fundamental substance of the universe is consciousness, that it isn't like cold, hard, dead stuff, as it seems to be when we're kind of looking around. It's that everything is consciousness, and therefore psi phenomena is real because you can manipulate the world to some extent, either the placebo effect on one end of the spectrum or full-blown telekinesis on the other end of the spectrum, that there's some way that our minds influence reality. And that is accounted for by that thesis. If everything is consciousness, then the evolution of our consciousness becomes the whole game rather than the acquisition of material goods. Attractors, this idea that I'm so fond of, they become very much real because they help guide our consciousness. So I know that this has been like a really tedious, in some places, debate with integrated information theory, but what do you think that our society needs to understand or at least consider in order for us to move forwards beyond this thing that's, I think, actually, in your or my case, making us a little bit ill at times of our lives?
Oh my God, I really believe strongly that scientific materialism or physicalism is really bad for your health. Like I really believe that. Yeah, it's not because humans thrive on having hope. It's like the only thing, not the only thing, but honestly, it's one of the most important factors in having the will to continue is you have to have hope. And I feel like physicalism or nihilism, like, this meaning crisis that we've going on is because people don't have hope that or, hope that their life is meaningful, hope that your life is purposeful. And I think for me, also when I was coming across this research, I had a difficult time with it, even though, because what we were talking about earlier, my ego and my personal development was not at that place where I could read that scientific research and just accept it. Even though I was a scientist, I still resisted for a long time. Every morning I would wake up with like mental anguish of like, like I can't believe this. Like my whole, world, everything's threatened. And so you Oh, I totally lost my train of thought.
Well, I,
I was remembering those mornings when I would wake up and I would wake up every morning and I would have to review the evidence because I would wake up not believing it. Imagine that every day. It's like Groundhog Day. Like you wake up and like review the evidence to be like, no, you didn't fall for it. You're not stupid. You read the science. It was real. So no, it's going thumb at me.
well,
But yeah, so like I was in that place initially, and it took a lot to get past it. But one thing that helped me was when I reached philosophy and learned that there were other worldviews, because then it suddenly, because it's like you're living in the box of physicalism and scientific materialism. And so when you see this reincarnation or psychic phenomena, you try to fit it inside of physicalism and scientific materialism, and it doesn't fit. And then that's where the crisis happens. Like for me, that's what the crisis. I was like, but how, but how, but how? And then it wasn't until finally I started reading some philosophy and I was like, oh, there's all these other possible worldviews like panpsychism or idealism. And it's actually not settled which one is real or not. And if you go to any of the other worldviews, then this evidence becomes much easier to understand and explain. And suddenly it's not a big deal anymore. And so that crisis is just dissolved. And that's what happened for me. And I think that's what happens for a lot of people. And it's just that in science and in all of our education, we're never taught that, hey, we're teaching you within this worldview of physicalism and scientific materialism, but there are other worldviews that other cultures have that are possible. And no one really knows. Yeah, they just never tell you that. And they should. They should tell you.
well, one of the intuitions I've had over the last few years has been that, humanity had shaman for, like a million years, something like that. And it was a societal function that was well established across the entire world. And then we basically stopped talking about it, and not just stopped talking about it, we actually started repressing the role of the intuitive in our society. And you can either believe that that's because it was straight magical thinking, or you can believe that they had access to a different experience of reality that we've since denigrated. And I worry that's happening really seriously to our detriment. But if on a much more positive perspective, quote unquote, magic is coming back, the way I see magic now is simply as the concession that there might be hidden forces outside of us, and that if we find a way to align with those forces, our lives go better. And for me, a lot of the time, that simply but practically has manifested in assuming that the outside world is intelligent, much more intelligent than maybe other people think that it is. And if you imagine the soul essence concept doesn't just apply to massive events in your life, but applies to things happening on a moment to moment basis, and that the universe is continuously in an intelligent relational way offering you cues and offering you opportunities to learn lessons. I found that has made a very significant practical and material difference to my daily life.
Yeah, me too. I basically see the universe as a mirror or like existence mirror and uh, uh, axiom as above, so below. I mean, I really is like I look for cues in my external world or my internal world, but sometimes, you're not connected to your internal world. So I'm looking for cues in my external world to see what I'm missing internally.
I think a lot of people listening to this, who maybe have never encountered these ideas before, will think, well, blimey, why don't I just go and try and learn to do these things? And yet you do have this thing that comes out of the spiritual literature fairly loud and clear, which is this stuff's a sideshow and also prone to abuse. Um, Maybe don't do that. Is that something that you've thought about? Or is that like, if this stuff is all a sideshow, what's the point of psi within a larger context?
Yeah, I think that is one viewpoint. But again, I think there's other viewpoints like Michael Murphy, who was one of the co-founders of the Esalen Institute, has written some great books. And Jeff Kripal, who has written a book about Esalen, which I love. And his view was kind of counter to that. Like he had read all the, Eastern philosophies and spiritual philosophies, and I think if you take the view of evolution, I think you can also step back and think, well, maybe that was true earlier when humans were not as consciously evolved. But maybe as we evolved or evolve, we have evolved, and as we continue to evolve, maybe that's evolving as well. That's what Michael Murphy put forward anyway. So he's like, maybe it wasn't good for people in the past to have access to these abilities or to focus on them, but maybe that's different now. I mean, I do think that the number one goal for most people is or should be self-actualization or self-realization. And part of that is what we talked about earlier, like getting to know your emotional reactions, your traumas, your wounds. Because if you don't know what those are and you don't heal them, then when you turn to something like magic, that's going to show up in your magic. That's not like you don't want that. Or you're going to be doing things for the wrong reason, and you may not see it, but the universe will see it. So it is still the goal to clear yourself of those wounds and traumas. And that's they talk about that in the past life regression. I'm sorry, in the past life, but also the reincarnation, like all of those spiritual things. It's you have these wounds you accumulate over lifetimes, and then you come back to heal them. That's the point of being here.
If this stuff exists on a bell curve, and there's always grifters in every industry, if people are listening to this and they're like, maybe there's something to what these crazy people are talking about, and maybe they've lost someone close to them recently, or maybe they're interested in whether they're going to get that promotion, and they want to go out and consult someone who is holding themselves up as a psychic or intuitive.
Mm.
How do you think of that in life? How do you assess whether anyone's any good? How do you prevent being taken advantage of? Like, how do you even navigate a marketplace that doesn't have any quality controls?
I mean, that is a tough one because, basically you just have to ask people to see if they found a good one. That's how I pretty much, no, that's how I originally stumbled on the ones that I went to. And then I have one that I work with mostly now, and I actually stumbled on her kind of by accident. But anyway, or nothing's an accident, I guess. But yeah, it is hard. It's not regulated, but there are some certifications that they can get, and you can look for those. So yeah, there's like I can't remember right now. I used to know all of this better. One I could look it up later and send you the links.
We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember them, but like there's one or two or three schools that, whatever, entities, organizations that where you can get sort of tested and certified. As for mediums, the Forever Family Foundation, who I just became friends with, one of the founders, and I'm obsessed with him. So the Forever Family Foundation is awesome. It was this husband and wife who lost a child, and so they set up this foundation to a really, really difficult test for mediums to pass. And I don't know if they give a actual certification, but whatever, they pass the test, they get listed on their site as mediums that they have tested. And the really big ones, a lot of the really big ones are on there, like Teresa Caputo, Kim Russo, Laura Lynn Jackson, and a bunch of others. So, but the problem is once they get tested and pass that, they become famous and hard to access. But they do have a list on the Forever Family Foundation. And then the Windbridge Institute also has a list. And then I'll have to find the schools and send you those later.
I can hear my inner skeptic, who is an incredibly annoying person, saying like, well, if these people exist, why haven't they won the lottery 15 times? Why aren't they running the world? And maybe they are and we don't know about it. But like, do you have a standard response for like the whole James Randi thing? For anyone that's not familiar,
Oh my
James,
God.
he
Yeah.
put up like $1 million prize for anyone that could prove psi abilities, I think, live on air, and it's never been claimed. So whenever I bring this topic up to anyone that knows anything about it, they always bring up the Randi prize, and I don't have a good answer, and I'm wondering whether it's something you've run into.
Yeah. So first of all, the James Randi Prize is not a scientific experiment. So there are scientific experiments that have looked at psychic phenomena or psi, and we already talked about those. I
Right.
look to science, not to a competition for evidence. So I don't know why people keep mentioning the James Randi thing. Also, there was something else I wanted to say about that. When you're skeptical, you kind of shut it down. It's not oh, that's what I was gonna say. The universe is intelligent. So and it's also evolving and changing every second, right? So the thing with readings that you have to understand is what they tell, a good intuitive will tell you what I'm telling you is true right now at this moment. But if what I tell you changes something in you and changes your course the second you leave here, things could change. So in some sense, they're kind of useless, but they can be helpful because sometimes they do tell you things that are like your future, or they tell you a lot of things about yourself that are very helpful. So, I mean, I used to go to hear about my future, and I try not to do that anymore. Now I try to just get useful information of like, what do I need to heal? What's my block? Like, what's in my way right now? Because that they can tell you perfectly clearly. And that's something I can do. That's information I can use to heal or, whatever, get better. The future stuff is sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it's useful to get you excited or to have something to look forward to, but it can definitely change. So, you know, don't get too attached to it.
Yeah. One of the words, maybe my least favorite word within this context, that keeps coming up in all of the work around this, is this concept of love, that basically like strong psychic experience tend to cluster around people that you love, or bad things happening to people that you love that make them impossible to test. But also, you interviewed Dr. Julia Mossbridge, who said that not only was law enforcement using precognitives, but also people's ability to perform better on precognitive tests scaled up when they were in a state of unconditional love. And we obviously have this really awful, blunt association with the word love, but there seems to be something here in terms of the more loving we become, the more powerful we become. And I was wondering whether that had been something you had thoughts on.
Yes. Oh my gosh. You said I wanted to, I grabbed a pen and paper because there were so many things I wanted to respond to. But yeah, a lot of these spiritual, some of them, not all of them, emphasize that love is consciousness and is the foundation of the universe. And so the more you can get to a state of love, which humans mostly live in a state of fear, which is the opposite of love, the more your heart is closed, the less energy is flowing, the lesser inflow with the universe. So it makes sense that the more you open and get more inflow and with love, that your abilities would open. So what Julia says is very true. It's just very hard for humans because, like I said, you have to heal all those wounds that made you close down, close everything. And what's really interesting, I've been thinking about a lot lately that I'm going to write about soon, is that our biology and our physiology makes it particularly difficult to do that, which is kind of funny when you think about, oh, this is a game. Like the souls chose these bodies, these physical systems that go against your goal in life. Like from the moment you're born, you're collecting wounds and traumas out of your control. Your nervous system is literally like, this isn't safe. I'm not loved. I can't do this. Like I have to be, like constantly every second. And then you grow up and then you're like, wait, your whole point is to like, you're here to open your heart and love, but you have this like spreadsheet of wounds that have closed your heart. And so you have to undo it. But it really is they say Earth is the hardest school in the universe. um, yeah. Oh, I want to say something about the lottery too, is that a lot of intuitives, I mean, they do what they do as a service. Like you're here to serve others. That's, a huge emphasis in spiritual traditions, and it's very true. And even the people I spoke with, the researchers, when I was doing interviews for my book, these were people who worked for the government and worked on the psychic phenomena program for the government, which we can talk about that too if you want. But they said there seems to be some sort of ethical component to the universe, that like with the remote viewers from Stargate, that they could like a few times in a row, like play the stock market. They're like, but at some point it would stop working. And and there were multiple instances where they're like, we don't know. We just, our combined experience is that there's some sort of ethical component to it. And I mean, I'm sure people will roll their eyes, like, how are you going to prove that? But that's the thing, is that the universe has no obligation to bow to our scientific method whatsoever. Like if the universe is intelligent, you can't, it's not, you just can't put it in a lab. And, it doesn't want to be put in a lab and quantified and measured. It just doesn't work like that. So I don't know how to argue that with scientific materialists, but yeah, I mean, that is the truth. And you're right, because a lot of sometimes the psi phenomenon is not repeatable because it works better if you're not bored. And it does seem to work, like Jeff Kripal talks about this, it works sort of in moments of trauma for some people. And you can't replicate trauma in a lab
Mm.
ethically.
Well, on that ethical front, like I keep thinking about this line from a TV show Fallout that I saw a few weeks ago, which is when you're a different animal, will you want the same things? And I keep thinking about the fact that if your ability to become more intuitive and become more in tune and become more loving, if that scales with your powers, once you get to that level, you're not going to want to use those abilities for unethical things. So it's almost like a self-correcting mechanism, where it's once you get to that level, you actually understand that you only want to use these things in service. And so
Yeah.
it becomes this kind of positive cycle, which then doesn't explain black magic to me, because how can you have black magical abilities or manipulative abilities if that scales? I don't know whether that's something you've thought about.
I try not to think about black magic, but oh, I was gonna say there's this like amazing, I think it's a Wes Anderson short on Netflix. I don't know if it's still on there. I forgot what it's called, but it's
It's
exactly
called
this.
The
What is
Amazing Life
it?
of Henry Sugar or something like that.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
one. Oh my
Yeah.
God, such a beautiful storytelling of what you just said. It's so I love it. I love that short. It's amazing because it captures that perfectly well. It's like you're so motivated to learn this skill to be psychic to like win all this money. But then by the time you get there, like your heart is opened and you're like, oh, I just want to, I just want to give it away or whatever. So yeah, I do think that happens. The dark, yeah, I don't, I mean, I think it's possible to, I think it's possible to do magic with bad intentions. I just don't think you're going to get away without any consequences.
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah. So as we draw to a close, firstly, I'd recommend everyone seek out Mona's Substack and her book, and I think her work in general. I'll leave the last words to you, but anything you think needs to be done from here, how should people bring this into their lives in a daily way? Any practices you'd recommend? If you were listening to this and be like, that was awfully interesting, but what am I going to do next? Like, how do we think about framing that conversation?
Yeah, so let's see. When I started doing this, well, I was already meditating, but I started meditating more and then opening my awareness to like testing out this psychic waters and being like, I wrote about this in the book, like show me something, a scene from the next few days or something. And then I would see something, so I wrote it down, and then I would see what happens. And for me, many times it would, they may not be like full on scenes playing out. But the one I talk about in the book was I had this I said, show me something from the next few days. And then I saw this like dome half structure, these like geometric shapes. And then I had the thought Disney concert hall. And I was like, okay, whatever. So I wrote it down. And then spontaneously, one of my friends asked me like 2 days later, hey, do you want to go to Joshua Tree? Because we had always wanted to go. We had never been. And it was during COVID. So we're like, yeah, let's go to Joshua Tree. So we drove out to the desert and she's like, there's this big boulder we should go see. It's like the largest lone standing boulder in the United States or something. So we went to it. And as I got out of the car and it was sunny and I had a hat on, I was walking towards the boulder and I looked up and the shape of it was exactly what I saw in the meditation. And then at the same exact moment, my friend said, it looks like the Disney concert hall. And I just turned and stared at her and I was like, what did you just say? Like I had this whole moment, like the whole world was spinning. I had goosebumps, even though it was like 110 degrees Joshua Tree. And I was like, oh my God. I started flipping out and she's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, oh my God, I saw this whole moment in my meditation 2 days ago. And yeah, she had no idea what I was talking about. But so I had a few of those that convinced me, like those kinds of experiences started to make it very real for me personally, right? Like I had read the science, but then that started to happen and I was like, holy smokes, it works. So another thing was that if you read, like a lot of Dean Radin's work or any of his books are great because they're funny and easy to read. I started to think about, oh no, I walk around with no intentions and spewing a lot of negativity all the time. And so then I immediately started being very, very aware of what I was putting out and trying to make a conscious effort to change that. Cause I was like, wow, like I'm just walking around probably shooting, negativity into my environment. So I immediately started to change that. And I do think, and I started printing science, the results of science papers that I thought were really compelling and putting them up on my bulletin board as reminders because I would forget, and again, neural patterns are hard to change. The way you think, thinking patterns, emotional patterns are hard to change. And so, you have to remind yourself or whatever in whatever way you can. So I would print those. And because there was one study that showed, oh, so interesting. It was like, I can't remember exactly what it was. I used to have it on my board and I took it down, but it was like they looked at cells in petri dishes and they like had the intent for one of the, oh God, I can't remember what it was. But it was so cool. It was something about donation. They're like, okay, we're going to donate money to this organization and send the good karma from that to the cells in this plate. And then the cells in the other plate, I don't know, I guess got nothing, the control. And then they looked at and it was identical conditions. And then they looked and the karma plate did better. Like it was like 55% better growth of the yeast cells or whatever it was. So little things like that. I was like, oh, okay, acts of service are good for you, me, the universe should do those. Positivity is better than negativity. Check. Things like that.
Yeah, it really cemented to me reading your work and digging into it afterwards that, there's this very new agey expression, which is your thoughts create your reality. But then if you realize that if consciousness is primary, like if consciousness is kind of the foundation of everything, well, your thoughts really matter. Like your negative thoughts can actually
Yeah.
potentially influence other people negatively. They can go out and
Mhm.
harm other people. Like there is a real moral burden of responsibility that you have for what you're thinking about. And also the other thing was that one of the dominant themes of my life and work has been sensitivity to synchronicity. And a lot of that is a felt sense,
Mhm.
it is something that you feel embodied. That sense of goosebumps that I
Mhm.
get when I'm hearing something that's true, that is something that I think you can very much calibrate to, that a lot of people in a more, materialistic worldview probably don't give enough credit. But also that can be a really practical, positive guide in your life every
Mhm.
single day once you start to tune into it.
Yeah, and I think that people I've seen this, they get really upset with the idea that your thoughts create your reality. Like they're so upset about it. And I think the reason is because what they're thinking is that you think something and it immediately happens. And so their reaction is like, no, obviously the world doesn't work that way. If it did, I would have $1 million, whatever, I'd be a billionaire. And then they just get upset when people say that. But not everything has to work at the scale that you think it does. Like your thoughts, I mean, the way you behave, just from a neuroscience psychology perspective, does influence the way people behave with you. So, if you are negative and nasty, people are going to respond to you in that way, and no one's going to give you an opportunity. You know what I mean? Like these things are also very, the way subliminally, the way you move, the tone of your voice, all of those things actually just, scientifically affect how the world interacts with you. And like you're saying though, if you take it one step further and reality is made of consciousness, then yeah, it also can actually affect your physical reality, but it won't be at the scale that you think it is.
And I think that's a great caveat for a lot of this is that you look at all this stuff and you're like, my God, this must have really dramatic implications. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But often, your point about research is the effect sizes are
Yeah,
small.
small.
This is stuff that helps on the margin. And I think contextualizing that way is really helpful because you don't have to expect these big changes, but you also have to understand that it is going to impact your life even on a relatively small level.
Yeah, and the more you believe it, the more it works, the better it works. So then you do see bigger things, but you have to start small to believe it.
which then also, if the world is made of consciousness, the fact that you believe it with your consciousness makes it more likely. That then becomes a logical leap and an upward spiral that is also very possible. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Mona Sobhani, thank you so much for giving us your time today. Just remind us where we can find you and where we can buy your book.
We can buy the book wherever books are sold, but I have links to it on my website, which is monasobhaniphd.com. I have links to my Substack there, and I think links to everything are there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.